You're going to find this video very valuable because an actual beginner will be demonstrating the don'ts. And I can tell you I learned a lot myself, and I'm going to be able to help you better. The beginner helping us today is my teenage niece Lucille. Proof that you too can improve with this video. Lucille took a second shot at this background later on, and this time I was there helping her, and you can clearly see the difference on that second one. And this was only her second shot ever at a watercolor project. Hi, this is Françoise. Welcome back to my channel. Lucille is going to voice the key elements for a beautiful watercolor background, and I'm going to explain each one of them as we compare her process with mine. Lucille, take it away with our first do.
Use the right watercolor paper.
With watercolor, paper can make or break a painting, even for the seasoned artist. Backgrounds and skies require the use of a lot of water to look good and smooth. The problem is there are so many paper choices, brands, quantities, and types. It's just overwhelming to make a choice as a beginner. I remember that clearly from when I started. To see your best results in watercolor and here with this video, I strongly suggest to choose 100% cotton paper with a cold pressed texture. I'll link what I use and recommend in the description of this video. Not surprisingly, a lot of other artists recommend that as well, because it makes such a huge difference. I know it's more expensive than the wood pulp quantity, but it's well worth it if you plan to use the wet and wet technique in your paintings. 100% cotton paper absorbs more water and stays wet longer, while the other type, wood pulp paper, absorbs less and the paint dries way faster. Be careful though about what texture you get because 100% cotton paper with a hot pressed texture absorbs less than 100% cold pressed. Cold pressed is definitely better for wet and wet. I tested this painting on hot pressed paper myself, and even though it's 100% cotton, there are blotches all over, stains. I found it impossible to work with this paper for this kind of project. The cold-pressed 100% cotton paper, however, reacts very differently to the paint and water. The paint is able to spread nicely and melt into the paper, provided you wet the paper first.
Use the right technique.
To get this kind of look, usually for backgrounds, skies, things like that, you want to make sure you use the wet and wet technique. This means you wet the paper first, then you apply a mix of paint and water. Here, Lucille and I used the wet and dry technique to show you the difference. The paper was dry as we applied the paint, and this technique is more suited to details in watercolor, not backgrounds generally. You can see how fast the paint is drying, almost instantly. It's nearly impossible to go pick up more paint that it's already dry, and yet here, I'm more experienced than my niece, but it's just not working even though I was doing my best to avoid harsh edges. The wet and wet technique, however, is great for large areas as the paint doesn't dry as fast, which makes sense since we're adding water on the paper before even applying any paint. Doing this is going to allow you to work on your background for a while without seeing harsh edges forming. It's the best technique to use for a smooth look where things actually blend together nicely, smoothly, whether it's one or several colors. Now on to our next do.
Pre-wet the paper properly.
We know the wet and wet technique is better and that requires us to wet the paper first. That's great, but how do we execute this technique the right way? Let's see what Lucille did. After our catastrophic wet on dry experience, I told her she'd need to wet her paper for the actual demo. Then I let her decide how she was doing it and what paintbrush she would use, and I stepped away. I see she used a large brush, which is not a must for this stage of just wetting the paper, but it's still a good thing to do when you're working on a large area. You go faster and there is less time for your paper to dry, right? I see she also goes back and forth, and that's great because it helps getting into all the nooks and crannies of the paper. Now I think she should keep wetting the paper a little longer because we want to make sure and give the water time to penetrate the fibers in the paper. If you just wet the surface quickly, if you stop when you're done putting water everywhere like she just did, it's going to dry fast. That's a common problem everyone experiences with watercolor, especially beginners. And it was interesting to see from the footage I have that Lucille wet her paper for 32 seconds and that I took 63 seconds to do the same. Imagine that I added at least twice as much water on that piece of paper during that period of time. I also rubbed my brush back and forth in there a lot longer. I know from watching her on her second attempt that she was not adding enough water in the beginning. The brush would scrape the paper because it was too dry, when instead it should glide on it. And this is how you would know that there is enough water to begin with. Then you want to make sure to rub that water in by making back and forth motions so it penetrates the paper, because we do not want to overdo it and have puddles on the surface. However, we want to see water on the surface when we stop. The paper must be glistening and there should be an even and thin coat of fresh water resting on the surface. This is why you shouldn't be afraid to add more water on the paper after you had most of it penetrate the fibers. Thanks to Lucille, we've got that part covered really good and you will be able to improve at this stage. Let's move on to the next two.
Prepare your color mixes ahead of time.
It's important to prepare your paints before you even wet your paper. In Lucille's footage, I see she isn't always picking up the same amounts of paint and water as she goes through the base layer. Here she drops a bit of pure paint. There it's more watery. It's not consistent all the way through. And the pure paint makes streaks on the paper too. We can imagine this is going to dry faster than the areas where she added more water and create the blotchy look we want to avoid. When you mix your paints ahead of time, not only are you going to be more consistent with the amounts of water and paint you add on the paper, which will save you lots of trouble, I'll show you why later, but you'll also save a lot of time and you can work longer without the paper drying while you're mixing paints. It is better to make a very watery mix like this one first and keep adding a bit of paint in it as you progress. Also, I see Lucille is not painting in terms of layers, which is natural since this was her very first attempt. She didn't know much about painting with watercolors. Here she's picking up more paint from the pan directly, it looks like, because she does not have a mix ready, and she's thinking in terms of contrast and not layers. She's trying to make this part really dark right away. Not thinking in layers is a problem because it forces you to change the ratio of paint to water constantly. It makes you waste some time while the paper dries, and while you're taking care of one area, all the areas that are still paint-free are drying even faster than the others, since you haven't been adding any additional water to them yet. There is a huge wetness discrepancy between the areas you're working on and the ones that are waiting, and that is a problem if you're going for a smooth look and beautiful blends. What you guys should remember is that with watercolor, it is better, no matter the technique, to start with light colors. When you're done with one layer, you layer with a darker color, and so on till the end of the painting. It avoids mistakes like going too dark too fast, and it really helps with the piece looking smooth like mine does. I took the time to layer with a light mix of paint first, then a darker one, and so on. I increased the amount of paint on my mix gradually while keeping the paper wet enough by adding paints equally on all the parts that are not staying white, and I didn't waste any time doing it because my original mix was ready, and all I had to do was to add a bit of paint to it every time I increased the intensity of color.
Use the right paint brushes.
Lucille and I both used the same paintbrush here. She did pick a good one to get the job done. It's a size 12 round brush that is big enough that we're able to cover an area quicker than if we were to use a tiny brush, let's say. I could have used an even bigger one, but I went for that one because of the fine tip that helps me make detailed adjustments if I need to. But it really is not a must for something like a plain background or sky to have this fine tip. I could have also managed, I think, with a smaller one, but I feel this size here is perfect to what I did, and since I have that choice, I went for it. Do the best you can with what you have if you're getting started.
Keep adding paint with the right amount of water.
After the paper type and the technique, this has got to be the most important thing to manage beautiful watercolor backgrounds. There's something called the water to paint ratio. The more water, the lighter the color will be. The more paint, the darker it will be. This is one side of the equation. The other one is the water that's on your paper. I'll link a helpful video I made about water control here. It will help you understand it better. Basically, what happens is you're supposed to add as much humidity with your brush than there is on paper. When this is not the case, two things can happen. First, if your brush holds less than there is on paper, the paint you drop on the sheet will not only be darker but also spread less fast. There is a risk for a harsh edge. This is the case here when Lucille makes the dark areas on the fairly wet paper at the very beginning of her painting. In my version, you can see there's already a lot of water on the paper, and I'm not afraid to add more as I start dropping the paint, and you can see how the paint flows and spreads beautifully. Do not worry if this is a bit hard at first. Of course, it's going to take practice to spot if your brush is wet enough or not. It's normal. In Lucille's second try, I helped correct the amount of water, and you can see there are no harsh edges. The second thing that can happen is if your brush holds more water than is on the paper. You can see here it is the case. The paper has started to dry since Lucille painted the dark areas. I think she added a lot of water because she wanted a lighter tone there, but the extra water pushed the drying pigment away when she dropped it. That's called a bloom or a cauliflower. In my painting, remember I am thinking in terms of layers, from light to dark, which makes it easier to avoid this because in my case, when I had lighter colors requiring a lot of water, the paper was also very wet, and as I'm adding darker colors requiring way less water, the paper is also less wet.
Increase contrast gradually.
Increasing contrast is exactly what I just mentioned. Work from light to dark. It will help control the water better. And it's the thing about watercolor. Unlike most other mediums, you really have to see through a reference in terms of layers. You need to ask yourself what this thing you're trying to paint would look like if it was blurry and lacked saturation. This is the base layer. After that, you can add more layers using more and more paint, little by little. If, in the case of a background like this, the paper is starting to dry early, if you see the paint isn't spreading much or not at all, it is better to stop, let the surface dry completely, wet like we did in the beginning, maybe not as much if you're ready to add darker tones, and keep painting.
Let the paper dry completely before another layer.
That's right. I don't have footage for this here, but let's say you try and layer over paper that's almost dry but not quite. The paint beneath might be lifted off when you re-wet the paper and even migrate and melt into places you don't want it to go to. It's really important to wait. I use a heat gun or a hairdryer most times when I'm in a hurry. You know everything about how I manage this kind of painting. I hope this teaching style has helped you. If it did, please thank and encourage my niece in the comments. She did a great job and helped a lot. Feel free to also like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more tutorials. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.